Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of our Great Books program. We took a break over the spring trimester in May, June, July, and August, but we're now back for September, October for our Great Books program. This is one of my favorite courses at the Wisdom School and at Ubiquity University, just to take a pause once a month and just contemplate a great work of world literature. We cover every historical period, ancient and modern, East or West. We are doing, in this particular case with Mary Oliver, a contemporary poet who only very recently passed, but who has inspired, and many of us have met when she was alive, one of the great poets of our time. So I want to introduce Carolyn Baker, who's well known to those of you who've been tracking Humanity Rising. She recently wrote a book with Andrew Harvey called Radical Regeneration, but she's best known for her works and books on how to navigate the coming chaos, which is actually the title of one of her books, and also Sacred Demise. You know, how do we, at a time of climate turbulence, escalating all around us, how do we come to terms with a world that is spinning out of control? We yearn for peace and harmony and stability and normalcy, but that is increasingly scarce anywhere you look around the world. Just in the news last night from Global Witness, it was broadcast on the BBC World News. 2020 set a record for 227 environmental activists somewhere in the world who'd been murdered. And they calculated that since 2015, 4 environmental activists are murdered every week on average. And 2019, and then again 2020, set all-time records. Colombia leads the world in murders, followed by Brazil and Nigeria, Peru, the Philippines, and 1/3 of the people who were killed are indigenous. So we have, the Trump phenomenon in the United States and all the craziness of the big lie, and not only election deniers, but climate deniers that have seized the mainstream of the Republican Party. And it's really challenging as we meet today, sort of to know what is true and what we need to now do as a community. And as you know, we've been launching through Humanity Rising, the Global Regeneration Corps, where now hundreds and thousands of groups are now coming together in a strategic formation to develop pods, small groups of what we're calling regeneration first responders, to build a global Indra's net of regeneration around the world. Is one of the ways that we want to enter in to this period of sacred demise. How do we, in this time of escalating turbulence, how do we understand what's happening? How do we come together as a community? How do we contemplate the great works of literature in a way that serves the solace of our souls, but also inspires us with a greater devotion to the good and a greater commitment to come together? And there is very few people that I know of anywhere that can contemplate these issues with more acuity and heartfulness than Carolyn Baker. She was a psychologist for many, many years. She's taught psychology and history for many years at the university level. So Carolyn, I want to welcome you with an open heart today. And I turn the program over to you. And you all know the drill. All of you students out there, that Carolyn will speak for a while. She may pause and ask you to raise your hands and interact. But this is a graduate seminar, so we're counting on all of our students to interact in a robust way with a brilliant speaker who's going to lead us in a contemplation of one of the works of Mary Oliver. Carolyn, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. It's wonderful to be with you again. And it's such an honor to be able to teach this course, and not just to teach it, but to get your feedback and your input. There will be a period of time at the end of today's session, which is 90 minutes, in which we will have question and answer, but we'll have some interaction before that as well. So Jim has introduced a little bit about me, and I thought we might just take a moment to quiet ourselves as we enter the world of Mary Oliver. So if you could just get comfortable in your chair or couch or wherever you are right now, and put aside pencil and paper and other distractions, and just begin by getting your body comfortable and closing your eyes and taking 3 or 4 really deep, long breaths, and just allowing the tension, the craziness, the chaos, the whatever you have encountered already today to just kind of melt, to just let it go. As you breathe, allow yourself to feel your body sitting in the chair, your feet on the floor, the beating of your heart. And bring yourself to your center, to your core. As we stand and sit in the presence of greatness, in the presence of a woman who truly felt herself as part of the earth, telling us over and over, pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. And here's her little poem, Don't Hesitate. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate, give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back. That sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb. So, gently bring yourself back now to this present moment and this amazing woman, this amazing being that we are going to be considering today and once again next month. She was born in 1935 during the Great Depression in semi-rural Ohio. Her father was an athletic coach, and she studied at Ohio State and Vassar College, but she never did actually receive a degree. However, she taught at various colleges, and her poetry is very much grounded in memories of Ohio and her adopted home of New England, which happened, most of her poetry set around Provincetown after she moved there in the 1960s. And she was very influenced by the writings of Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau, because they really resonated with her naturalist spirit. Very importantly, in the 1950s, she met photographer Molly Malone Cook, who would become her partner for over 40 years. Cook wrote a book actually of photos and journal excerpts, which Mary Oliver compiled after Cook's death. And she writes about Molly, "I took one look and fell hook and tumble." Molly was Mary's literary agent, and they made their home largely in Provincetown, where they lived until Molly's death in 2005, and where Mary continued to live until she relocated in Florida and passed, I believe it was last year or the year before. I'm not remembering exactly, but it was recently. Of Provincetown, she recalled, "I too fell in love with the town, that marvelous convergence of land and water. Mediterranean light, fishermen who made their living by hard and difficult work from frighteningly small boats, and both residents and sometimes visitors, the many artists and writers, and I decided to stay." Now, those 40 years with Mary and Molly were lived long before LGBTQ marriages were legal. And I thought that I would just share my screen and show you a photo of Mary in her prime. This is Mary in her, I would guess, her 40s in Provincetown. Appropriately where Mary would have to be on the beach with a shell in her hand and loving being out in nature along the seashore. Now, understandably, she wanted to continue to live where she had made her life with Molly, and certainly in an LGBTQ friendly milieu, as Provincetown is, especially in an area that was far more homophobic than our own. She wanted to be in Provincetown. And her book, New and Selected Poems, was dedicated to Molly, who died of lung cancer in 2005. And I just want to read a poem that Mary wrote as Molly was dying. It's called University Hospital. Very powerful, poignant poem. The trees on the hospital lawn are lush and thriving. They too are getting the best of care, like you, and the anonymous many in the clean rooms high above this city, where day and night the doctors keep arriving, where intricate machines chart with cool devotion the murmur of the blood, the slow patching up of bone, the despair of the mind. When I come to visit and we walk out into the light of a summer day, we sit under the trees, buckeyes, a sycamore, and one black walnut brooding high over a hedge of lilacs, as old as the red brick building behind them, the original hospital built before the Civil War. We sit on the lawn together, holding hands while you tell me you are better. How many young men, I wonder, came here, wheeled on cots off the slow trains from the red and hideous battlefields to lie all summer in the small and stuffy chambers, while doctors did what they could, longing for tools still unimagined, medicine still unfound, wisdom still unguessed at, and how many died staring at the leaves of the trees, blind to the terrible effort around them to keep them alive. I look into your eyes, which are sometimes green and sometimes gray, and sometimes full of humor, but often not. And I tell myself you are better, because my life without you would be a place of parched and broken trees. Later, walking the corridors down to the street, I turn and step inside an empty room. Yesterday, someone was here with a gasping face. Now the bed is made all new. The machines have been rolled away. The silence continues, deep and neutral, as I stand there loving you. Now, one of the things that Mary constantly reminds us of is her personal marriage of pain and joy. And she invites us to open to and accept the same marriage. She says over and over, we shake with grief, we shake with joy. What a time these two have, housed as they are in the same body. And one of the things we hear consistently in her poems is the presence of both grief and joy, pain and joy. Many of her poems are poignant and reflect the pain that she carried, just as the one I just read you. But more often, they're testimonies of how a human being can hold pain and joy at the same time. She says in her poem, One or Two Things, she says, one or two things are all you need to travel over the blue pond, over the deep roughage of trees, and through the stiff flowers of lightning. Some deep memory of pleasure, some cutting knowledge of pain. I'd like to just repeat that. One or two things are all you need to travel over the blue pond, over the deep roughage of trees, and through the stiff flowers of lightning. Some deep memory of pleasure, some cutting knowledge of pain. In a 2011 interview, and I think it's the only time she ever mentioned this publicly, she disclosed that she had been sexually abused by her father and that her mother had been neglectful. In Blackwater Woods, which many of you are probably familiar with, one of my favorite poems, she says, every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this. The fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this, the fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. All of the great spiritual traditions revere paradox as a gracious and necessary teacher. So what is paradox really? Merriam-Webster says a statement or proposition that, despite sound or apparently sound, reasoning from acceptable premises leads to a conclusion that seems senseless, logically unacceptable, or self-contradictory. That's the dictionary definition. One of the great gifts of Mary Oliver's poems, and I believe the reason they resonate with and deeply touch so many of us, is that she herself was a living paradox and lived paradox. As she says in the family poem called The Family, she says, "The dark things of the wood are coming from their caves, flexing muscle. They browse the orchard, nibble the sea of grasses around our yellow rooms, scarcely looking in to see what we are doing and if they still know us. We hear them, or we think we do, the muzzle lapping moonlight, the tooth in the apple. But put another log on the fire. Mozart again on the turntable. Still there is sorrow with us in the room. We remember the cave. In our dreams, we go back, or they come to visit. They also like music. We eat leaves together. They are our brothers. They are the family we have run away from. They are our brothers. They are the family we have run away from. Both the sorrow and the joy. And poetry is meant to touch us at a deeper level than the words. From my perspective, the really important work of this course is not to study how Mary wrote her poetry, but why, and to ponder how her poetry touches our individual lives. So I'd like us to take about 10 minutes to just do a little writing exercise that only you are going to see. We'll do some sharing about it if you want to, it's not required. But to make this more real to ourselves, I'd like us to take about 10 minutes to just write in answer to this question. What paradoxes are you struggling with in your own life? What paradoxes are you struggling with in your own life? And after we write, we'll take some time to share verbally. As I said, not required. Let's begin. let's take another minute or so to finish up. I'm not sure if I'll be able to see you, but feel free to raise your hand if you would like to speak about your reflection.
I can promote anyone who would like to raise their hand and bring them in to the room visually as well, Carolyn.
Okay. Anyone?
All right, I see Jonathan Macleod first. Jonathan, I'm promoting you to a panelist.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And there I am. I've never been a panelist before. This is quite exciting. Just as I'm having read that, Mary Oliver for quite some time, what I caught interesting was the nature of your question around paradox, right? And my reflection briefly is this notion of expanding into a contraction. And so there's this interesting vortex that's kind of comes. So when you're young, right, and you're a child, if you're 10 years old, well, then 1 year is 10% of your life. And that seems like an extraordinary long period of time. And when you're 70, 1 year is barely a fraction of a percent. And so it brings to mind this study and this course of discourse that we're all in, where we have this expansion of our minds and our spirits and our psyches and our intellects by being actively engaged in learning. But in my case, I'm doing all this expansion into a contracting amount of time left. And so there's this paradox where I see it. I see this, you would think it might come to a critical mass moment and then expand on the other side. But it's just a reflection about how the sum becomes more than all the parts added together.
Mhm.
So that's really what occurred for me, was this notion of expanding into a contracting vessel, if you will.
So true. As we age, so much more paradox. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Jonathan. Would anyone else like to speak?
I have a Laura Madsen that I'm now promoting to panelist.
Great.
Laura, you're in the room.
Hi, Laura.
It looks like you're still muted.
Still muted.
There we go.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm in the kitchen doing our grapes, and I was just listening, and I thought, oh, I'm going to do the exercise. So I was going to write it in the chat, and then as soon as I pressed for the next line, it posted. So I thought I'd come on and finish my thought.
Okay.
So the first thing that came is paradox is not a struggle when it is lived, and heart and mind are free to dance. where becoming and belonging live in the expanse of a soul in God. And then I paused and I thought, okay, there's more. Caught in time, paradox is constant struggle, as I judge through this or that, and my jaw clenches with the impossible demands of a surrendered life.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your teaching, Caroline.
Welcome. It's not a struggle if we can open to it, but for many people, it's very difficult in our Western culture to hold the opposites in the same consciousness, in the same body. That's not what we do in this culture. We're very binary. Thank you.
And
Would
it
anyone
looks
else
like
like to speak?
we have one more, Zoo Peters, that I'm promoting to panel. Zoo, you're ready to go. Are you there, Zoo?
Okay, can anyone hear me now?
I
Yes.
can hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Okay. Couple of thoughts came to mind in terms of paradox. The first is wanting to participate in life, and in my eagerness, kind of getting active, and at the same time feeling the need to pause and connect with the miracles that I'm surrounded with. Exactly all the things that Mary Oliver so beautifully put. Every little living being, there is this amazing, it's a miracle. Now, I can't describe it any other way. And then, admiring this miracle, the leaves, vegetables, plants, and yet eating them and using them. And then wanting clean, clear air, and at the same time needing to go places and use my car to go places. Or I'm now in Europe right now, I live in Canada, attending a course in Italy and taking the plane. So I find myself thinking about this. It is, for me, a paradox.
Thank you so much. I would just like to mention as we move on that one of the great paradoxes that I encounter often as I do grief workshops and as I work with people around grief is the one that Mary Oliver speaks of so clearly, which we shake with grief, we shake with joy. And it's not in our computer in this culture to hold those two together. If we're in grief, then how can we experience any joy? If we're in joy, how can we experience grief? And what's really true is they are opposites that travel together and need each other. And so I find that as people allow themselves to grieve, this opens them to experiencing joy at a deeper level. And instead of looking for happiness, they begin to experience joy. And that as people truly experience joy, they often find that there's a sorrow in it, or somehow their grief will be triggered. And one of the clearest explanations, or not explanations, but expressions of this is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, in which he talked about, and he survived Auschwitz, And he talked about getting through his days by finding meaning. And certainly he experienced sorrow all the time, but there were these moments of joy that came in and moments of meaning that gave him joy, that allowed him to hold these opposites and move through them and survive mentally. And he was fortunate to survive physically as well. So I just wanted to add that as we move away from that exercise and move on to what I consider the three most important words from Mary, or three most important phrases: pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. If you don't pay attention, you won't be astonished. And if you're not astonished, you'll have nothing to tell. So what does it mean really to pay attention? She doesn't ever really define that or tell us, but she repeatedly shows us how to pay attention. And reading another one of her poems, October, we get a sense of what it really means to pay attention. There's this shape, black as the entrance to a cave. A longing wells up in its throat like a blossom as it breathes slowly. What does the world mean to you if you can't trust it to go on shining when you're not there? And there's a tree, long fallen. Once the bees flew to it like a procession of messengers and filled it with honey. I said to the chickadee singing his heart out in the green pine tree, little dazzler, little song, little mouthful. The shape climbs up out of the curled grass. It grunts into view. There is no measure for the confidence at the bottom of its eyes. There is no telling the suppleness of its shoulders as it turns and yawns. Near the fallen tree, something, a leaf snapped loose from the branch and fluttering down, tries to pull me into its trap of attention. It pulls me into its trap of attention. And when I turn again, the bear is gone. Look, hasn't my body already felt like the body of a flower? Look, I want to love this world as though it's the last chance I'm ever going to get to be alive and know it. And in this poem twice, she talks about the trap of attention. I think that the first requirement is to surrender to what's in front of us, allowing ourselves to be trapped by what we're experiencing. And for me, that means allowing the ego to be taken over momentarily, disoriented, feeling kind of tricked or seduced or surpassed by what's happening in the moment. And the place where I find this to be exquisitely true is when we truly commune with nature, which of course Mary did all the time. There aren't a lot of safe places in the world where we can do this, but nature is one of those places. To allow ourselves to be disoriented, tricked, seduced, and surpassed by what's happening in the moment. And in my opinion, this is the principal attitude that we must take with us as we engage with nature. We don't go into nature to give labels to species. We don't allow ourselves to be preoccupied with our grocery list or some work project. If that happens, we bring ourselves back to the moment and just stop, look, listen, smell, and feel. As we engage with nature, this might require a lot of practice, but it will ultimately bring us into a state of amazement. And we don't have to worry that that will never happen. Why? Because we are nature. And because our species has spent thousands of years in nature being amazed by it. We had to. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived. Now, of course, humans have created countless spiritual practices like meditation, yoga, making art, making music, writing, prayer, ritual. The list is endless. Mary's spiritual practice obviously was allowing herself to become enchanted with nature. Her spiritual path was nature, and her uncanny capacity for paying attention to it was an exquisite form of worship. So that's the first invitation. Pay attention. The second is be astonished. Be astonished. What does that really mean? I go back to one of my favorite poems. One of my favorite poems in her new and selected poems called When Death Comes. When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy and as singular, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending, as all music does, towards silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say, all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. When it's over, I want to say, all my life was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. So there are two pieces here. One is the bride surrendering to amazement. The other is the bridegroom taking the proactive choice to take the world into our arms. Why? Because otherwise, as she says at the very end of the poem, we'll just end up having simply visited this world. The bride bears witness. The bridegroom takes action. And here are the two pillars of our environmental activism. We commune with nature and allow ourselves to be smitten by it. And then we rise up and we take a stand for nature. And then her final invitation, tell about it. Tell about it. This is another proactive choice. I'm not going to just keep all this wonderful stuff inside. I'm going to tell about it. Why? What is her ultimate purpose in telling about it? Well, it's as if she would have exploded if she weren't able to tell about it. I can almost hear her saying, look, nature loves you unconditionally with all your imperfections and warts and defects of character, but damn it, she loves you anyway. Look at that. Feel that. Live as if you are lovable as you are. I'd like us to do another exercise of just sitting quietly and closing our eyes. Once again, to come into the body, to be aware of how you are sitting, what you are feeling, what sensations are happening in the body. And I'm going to read one of her most famous poems. And as I read it, I'd like you to notice what you feel in your body. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Once again, what did you feel? Or did you feel? Does anyone feel more alive? This time, let's take a moment to put some comments in the chat as we reflect on this reflection. Your chat is down in the middle of the bottom of your screen. And you can begin to write your reflection in the chat. Immense gratitude and flow, unconditional love, a settling down in my body and a pervasive sense of peace, forgiveness, grace, ease, joy and peace, a sense of openness, The lightest grasp carries the beauty. The texture of grass and the aroma of the earth. A deep sense of comfort. I feel much more understood and humanized, very calming down for the mind. I am part of the human family, but the bigger family is invisible and always divinely loving me unconditionally. Beautiful. Free from self-imposed duty. Thank you for your comments. And so my question was, did anyone feel more alive? Maybe you're familiar with one of her poems in West Wind. Are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? One of my favorite lines from Mary. You see, that's why paying attention and being astonished made her feel more alive. Not paying attention and not being astonished is not being fully alive. And no one knew that better than Mary. One reason that Mary's poetry is so astonishingly popular throughout the Western world is that it is her spiritual practice. And as we take it in, it stirs our awareness of the sacred in us and in the world. So we're coming up to the last half hour of our time together today, and I would like us to spend that time in conversation with questions or answers and or reflections or whatever you would like to share. And before we do that, I would like to put in the chat, but I'll state it first, your homework for the next session. Our next session on October 12th, I believe it is. And you have a choice. The first option is choose any poem by Mary and read it once a day for a week. Read it carefully and prayerfully. Notice what happens to you. You can journal about it. You can recite all or parts of it during the day. And you can also notice if you have any dreams related to it. That's one option. Or set aside a special time to spend at least 1 hour in nature. During that hour, pay attention as you never have before. Not in an analytical way, as if there's going to be a test later, but pay attention from your heart. Pay attention not only to nature, but to what happens to you as you pay attention to nature. Listen to it, smell it, touch it. And then if you really feel courageous, speak out loud to some part of nature. And in our next session, we will begin with the homework. Let me put that in the chat. And I also would like to invite you to listen. There's a wonderful interview of Mary by Krista Tippett from the website and podcast On Being. This is a really sweet interview, and I urge you to it. Before our next session, October 12th. And finally, I want to leave you with 3 things to remember from Mary. 3 things to remember. As long as you're dancing, you can break the rules. Sometimes breaking the rules is just extending the rules. Sometimes there are no rules. So let's open up our time together now with questions, answers, reflections.
Thank you, Carolyn. Typically, we begin our discussions with Georgie as our Dean of Graduate Studies, just to open things up while the students contemplate what they want to say. So Georgie, why don't you ask Carolyn a question?
Oh,
and then the
wonderful.
students just raise your hands as per usual.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you so much, Carolyn. What a wonderful presentation. What an amazing lecture. I must say that I haven't read Mary Oliver's work extensively in the past, but now I know so much more about her, and having read her book, I tried to summarize within me that what did I feel when I was reading her poems that were so different than reading Wordsworth or Shakespeare or other poets. And two words came to me, one of which is oneness, that how Mary really was looking for oneness, wanted to be with oneness, and was really describing oneness from different aspects, the sensations, the feelings, the experiences she had. And the other thing was that, which I don't find in Shakespeare or in Wordsworth or others, that I really felt myself within these poems. I felt that it didn't feel the dualistic way that, oh, well, that's a nice image. Oh, well, that's a nice picture. But I really felt almost that she was talking about me. And that's so special about her. And also that the nature, how she brought nature was really, and it is part of our life, but that was so natural to her. And then how she described it. So before I opened her book, I'm just gonna get some notes here. I read a sentence which says, "Our greatest challenge is not seeing the signs, but it is believing they are real." So when I read that, I was like, oh, that's good. So I opened the book, and the first poem comes to me, and this is exactly connected to this sentence. And the poem is titled, "I Wake Close to Morning." Why do people keep asking to see God's identity papers when the darkness opening into morning is more than enough? Certainly, any God might turn away in disgust. Think of Sheba approaching the kingdom of Solomon. Do you think she had to ask, is this the place? Well, like, I was already taken. I was already in it, like, wow, this is so amazing. She's so amazing. And I was keep reading on. And just another example, if you don't mind me sharing some of these, that how I do find myself in her work, that just a month and a half ago, I moved countries. Now I live in Paris, France. And then I'm reading this poem on storage. And I thought, this is what I've been going through in the past few months. And I relate to it so much. So she says, when I moved from one house to another, there were many things I had no room for. What does one do? I rented a storage space and filled it. Years passed. Occasionally, I went there and looked in, but nothing happened. not a single twinge of the heart. As I grew older, the things I cared about grew fewer, but were more important. So one day, I undid the lock and called the trash man. He took everything. I felt like the little donkey when his burden is finally lifted. Things, burn them, make a beautiful fire. More room in your heart for love, for the trees, for the birds who own nothing, the reason they can fly. It's just, yes, that's me in it. It's so true. So besides the oneness, besides me feeling within every single word of hers, I also felt that her work is so delightful, meaningful, fresh, profound. I felt that almost like a little butterfly going from one subject to the other, one object to the other, and yet it makes all sense. So here is just one more, and I let our students to come in with their comments. I go down to the shore. I go down to the shore in the morning, and depending on the hour, the waves are rolling in or moving out, and I say, oh, I am miserable. What should I do? And the sea says in its lovely voice, excuse me, I have work to do. It's just brilliant. It's just brilliant, really. So I actually don't have any questions. I look forward to more from you on her, because I feel so much how much you are connected to her, and you studied her extensively. I just thank you for talking about her and introducing her to me. I must say that as Jim started the introduction, that there's so much chaos, there's so much volatile events going on in the world. Reading her poetry, it is almost taking us out from this 3D and another space where we feel calmer, even though that some of her poetry is sad, like the death or others, but equally it is calming, as some of you said. So thank you so much, Carolyn, and I pass the word back to Jim.
Sure. You know, at the beginning of our next session, you know, you just said, Georgie, I look forward to hearing more about her. Well, you know, we're going to start with your homework in the next session, and you'll be telling us how she has stolen your heart, or how she's battered your heart, or whatever. Either one is important. Both are important.
Thank you, Georgie. Yeah, you know, for me, Carolyn, I always found Mary Oliver just simply arresting. You know, there's a lot of poets that you read that you kind of gloss over and the words kind of blur together, but there was something about Mary Oliver's poetry that kind of stops your world, especially the one that you read. About, you know, that you don't have to go 75 miles on your knees.
Wild geese.
You just have to have the animal love within you. I can still remember when I read it, I thought it just arrested me that this woman is piercing to the heart of reality. And so thank you for reading it. It was great. That's my favorite poem of hers.
It is many people. Yes, yes.
So students, just raise your hands, and Matt will bring you up into the audio visual, and we can have a discussion with Carolyn for the next 15 minutes.
Thanks, Jim. And I've promoted Juju into the room. Ju, you're ready to go. You may need to unmute your microphone.
Hi, hello.
Hello.
Okay, yes, great. Hi, hi, mentors and teachers. I'm very lucky. Yes, it's very nice to listen to Mary Oliver at first. I just think that she's doing the work very liberating. It has this kind of facade if I read her, and I'm still stuck on the idea of the paradox. I wanted to say something about the paradox thing. If maybe, yeah, if maybe everyone is understanding paradox as struggle, maybe I think it can also be kind of the opposite and the answer to one thing. And I don't know, maybe the one of the problems is that the people don't answer in the same hierarchy at the moment. So there are much more paradox created in this kind. So this is my opinion to paradox, and Mary Oliver, I'm looking forward to her more about her. Thanks.
I think paradox is a struggle, perhaps, when we first begin to look at it, because we're just not trained in this culture. It's sort of like asking a toddler to run a race, as an adult. It's a higher stage of thinking and reflecting, a higher stage of problem solving than we're used to in this culture. So at first, until we become familiar with it and surrender to it, it can be a struggle. I think our whole culture is struggling with paradox.
Yeah.
But as we open to it, then it becomes more a way of life. And instead of going very quickly to one side or the other, we become more able to hold the opposites.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks. Thank you, yeah. This was the idea, yes, thanks.
I don't yet see anyone else.
Well, perhaps this will stimulate some response. This is not the warm and fuzzy, luminous poetry of Mary that we've talked about this morning, but it certainly is a poem for the moment. This is called Of the Empire. We will be known as a culture that feared death and adored power, that tried to vanquish insecurity for the few and cared little for the penury of the many. We will be known as a culture that taught and rewarded the amassing of things, that spoke little, if at all, about the quality of life for people, other people, for dogs, for rivers. All the world in our eyes, they will say, was a commodity. And they will say that this structure was held together politically, which it was. And they will say also that our politics was no more than an apparatus to accommodate the feelings of the heart, and that the heart in those days was small and hard and full of meanness.
That's something to ponder. And in the spirit of that poem, Carolyn, I wanted to make an additional comment to your questions, Juju, about paradox. Because I think, and you may want to address this, Carolyn, from your books, Navigating the Coming Chaos and Sacred Demise, in some ways, paradox is now our world. And so it's not a hypothetical as much as an existential reality that I was actually referring to. It came out of a conversation that Georgie and I had earlier today before this conversation, where we were both commenting that, you know, it's almost like we're all losing our footing now. Because wherever we turn, not only are contradictory things happening, but we're in a situation where our governments are less and less capable of ensuring any kind of semblance of stability or normalcy. So we have simultaneously, you know, obviously expanding ecological turbulence. We have expanding political divisiveness. We have social media that is essentially built on false news and designing informations that reinforce beliefs and attitudes independent of their connection to reality. We're in a situation where the I would say the global culture is both coming together in increasing ways, but also splintering in increasing ways. Just take, for example, the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's part of the global culture, but it's part of a splintering. And how we take in all this information absent a organizing principle that makes it all make sense means, by definition, that we are now living in a highly paradoxical world. And I would add a term that you might look up from Carl Jung, and that is antinomy. Antinomy is deeper than paradox. A paradox is when, you know, different contradictions, you know, kind of hit you. But an antinomy, according to Jung, is when two or more internally consistent but mutually exclusive truths collide in your psyche. And I think we're moving into an antinomial world now, which means, and this is the solace of poetry, it's the solace of community, it's the solace of being part of a mystery school, it's the solace of, you know, taking a course like this, which means that we have to find some way in our interior to hold the antinomial reality that's pounding on us from the outside in. So I just want to acknowledge the I would say the fundamental importance of your question, because I think your question increasingly is our world. You know, and part of what it means to be in the climate tipping point is that we're going to look back pre-pandemic and with a nostalgia. Boy, it seemed all to make sense back then. But it no longer is making sense. Just as a quick example, this new Mu variant apparently is impervious to the vaccines. What does it mean, everyone? We're in a pandemic. Our governments and big pharma are saying, take a vaccine. And now this little virus is outsmarting big pharma. What do you do with that information? How do you process it in your mind? That's antinomy. Mm-hmm. When the paradoxes that you try to rationally understand start to break down on the hard rock of realities that are incontrovertible, but make no sense in any world that we can put together. So anyway, I just wanted to say, Juju, that was That's the question of our hour, I'm afraid. And I wish there was an answer, but I'm afraid there is not, at least for the moment, unless Carolyn or you or Georgie or somebody can figure out one.
Yeah.
We do have Jonathan Macleod in the room as well.
Hi there. Thank you very much. One of the things that it's not so I'll start with a statement and then go to the question, which is first of all, thanks for bringing up antimony. It was Jung's examination of God's interaction with Job, I believe, that he was really pinging on there. But you know, around here, at least in our practice, we talk about awareness equaling access. And so I really love the idea that what we're doing here, that the paying attention part and the being astonished part are linked for me intrinsically to awareness equaling access, because you certainly can't act without awareness, and you can't grow your awareness without a choice point or a decision to do that. Sometimes if you bring your awareness to something, you get access whether you like it or not. But if awareness therefore equals some access, how can we hold paradox in such a way that neither is wrong? You know, this it strips the judgment out of it, right? This isn't right or wrong. It isn't good or evil. It isn't any of those things. We have to strip the judgment and hold the paradox in its sort of duplicity or multiplicity and not judge any for its content. Can you stand where you stand without making another person wrong for where they stand? Mm-hmm. So when we talk about this, the pre-pandemic quote unquote normalcy that we are going to long for, which I already do, right? One of the things this has taught me is that there's a fluidity to normalcy. There's a fluidity to normalcy that I now have access of a way of thinking and being and acting. It's different based on my paying attention and holding that against the rigidity of cognitive bias, right? My entire socioeconomic life, my whatever it is, my faith, my family, my school, my entire world is filled with cognitive bias that says there's a one way per se, there's an orthodoxy, there's a rigidity to it. Now I have to hold that in paradox with the fluidity of normalcy. And how do I do that? I'm not asking really how, but I'm saying metaphorically, how do I do that without making either one of them wrong? And therefore getting perhaps maybe a sacred third somewhere in the middle that is an elegant way of allowing everything to be, or potentially none of it. It's a lovely thing to think about. So thank you so much, everyone, by the way, for your comments and participation and thoughts.
Carolyn, could I
Go ahead.
comment on that?
Please. Yeah.
What Jonathan's talking about, everyone, is the answer to Job that Jung wrote, which is one of my favorite books and introduced me to the antinomial reality of God, as Jung put it. But Jonathan, I want to make 2 points, which are really important from a Jungian point of view. One is that true antinomy is not dispensing with the awareness of the reality of evil. This is crucial in Jung's treatment of the story of Job. It's easy to say, well, you're in conflicting points of view. Let's honor all of them. And, you know, we dispense of this judgment that you're calling for. Jung isn't saying that. As I understand Jung, what Jung is saying is that, as he says, we have to not only acknowledge the evil, but allow it to enter into our vitals, he says. We have to let the evil come into our vitals, not relativizing it. not dismissing it as some, if there's A, there's B, and I may be experiencing, but it may be really not, and we're looking for some third thing. That's not what Job did, according to Jung. The brilliance and power of the book of Job is that he stood firm before God.
Mhm.
And he said, I don't understand why you're doing this to me, but I'm telling you, I am blameless. I am innocent. And at the end, it was God coming out of the whirlwind. Who art thou, O man? Where were you when I set the dawn and the oceans of the deep and created the Leviathan? Where were you? So in the end, God came in the magisterium of mystery, but Job stood his ground. And it was out of that ability of Job in the mystery of why would God create evil that was the transcendental power of that book, because in the end, Job was restored. So I wanted to make that initial point about the Jungian understanding. I think it's at a deeper psychic level. And the second point, which is important, which I think is screaming at us in the world today. We're not in a world of aimless relativism when it comes to Donald Trump. We're confronted by evil, intentional, willful evil from the dark side. And it's like being confronted by the Holocaust and by Adolf Hitler. And that's the power of Job. And that's the power of being able to let the evil come in to your vitals, says Jung, but also to be able to name it no matter where it's coming from. And because you can name it and know that you are blameless in the face of it, you can stand. And I think the brilliance of what happened last election here in the United States is that millions and millions and millions of Americans stood and had the biggest and most fraud-free election in history. Obviously, the onslaught from the dark forces continues. We're playing it out today here in California with a recall. The same mentality trying to erode democratic institutions. So anyway, I wanted to say that in the midst of antinomy, the conclusion is not sort of a relativism, but an ability to take a stand in the midst of the complexity. And it is in the taking of the stand, if you do it with enough moral purity, even God himself will bend the knee.
Yes.
So anyway, I just wanted to offer that other perspective on antinomy and to the answer to Job. But we're a little bit out of time. But Carolyn, give us a final judgment on this matter, since you said, or Jonathan, you may want to comment. This is such a rich discussion, everybody. This is so rich. So let's take a few more minutes. Jonathan, I'd love to have you give just a few minute response, and then Carolyn, you close us out.
Certainly so. I don't think that we could say that aimless relativism has any role in that particular person's cognitive bias. And I like the fact, I like the idea of potentially inviting shadow to the dance, because that without contrast, there's no capacity to understand it for what it is. And I understand the stand your ground part. It's lovely. I have to, just like Job, I'm probably going to come away with a limp after this one, but the,
That was Jacob.
yeah. Oh, that's right. Excuse me. But I try to look as though there's a vacuum of judgment around these things. Knowing them for what they are allows me to understand them potentially more so as they are. And when they arrive, it gives me the opportunity to examine them and say, I've heard this before. I've seen this before. I know this. I've seen this. And it allows me to build a resiliency, I hope, so that I have a context for what evil is and what the absence of evil is, which in my estimate is beauty.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you everyone for allowing me to comment today.
Great dialogue. Thank you, Jonathan. And Georgie, do you have a quick comment on this matter before we turn it over to Carolyn? Because we're getting to something very deep, everyone. This is, you get into answer to Job, you're going as deep as you can go in the human psyche.
That's
around
right.
these great mysteries.
Well, I have no further comment, actually. I think, Jim, you summed it up just marvelously. And, maybe we can get into this a little deeper in the next session. I would
love to. I would love to. I would even be willing to go back into answering Job and prepare a little something just to add to it. Because, Mary Oliver's playing with these issues.
Yeah.
With joy and pain,
Right.
Not separate, but integral.
Yes, absolutely.
And then letting, that soft living of the animal in your body still navigate through all of these complexities. There's a lot in here that's reminiscent of the answer to Job.
Yes.
And the story of Jacob with the angel,
Right.
Jonathan, that you just brought up. So this is a rich mix. Well, thank you, everyone. This is Carolyn. You've instigated a great discussion. Let's keep it going next month. You all have your homework. A poem by Mary Oliver that you should read every day for 1 week. Carolyn, is that it?
Mm-hmm. And it's all in the chat, and specifically how to go into nature. That's another piece of the assignment.
Good.
Another
Going
option.
into nature.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week. Next month, excuse me. See you next month on the 12th of October.